So I just want to acknowledge, as I'm doing this talk, that I am building on work that I've undertaken with Dr. Carys Rice at Coventry University and Professor Jeremy Dawson at the University of Sheffield, who were part of the team that I recruited to do our first professional standards report back in 2017. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is some work that's looking really and asking us to think very differently about sexual violence in the workplace and trying to outline how we need to think differently about this and our responses to it, and therefore how we can both detect it and check it and inhibit it going forward. So what I'm going to be talking about is a topic that can raise concerns, and so I just want to signpost you that there are a whole suite of different resources both at Edinburgh University and more widely, that if what I talk about today impacts on you, then please do reach out. My intention is to inform, but I'm aware that discussing this can have an impact on people. So sadly, this is a very pertinent topic. I mean, just opening the newspapers over the weekend kind of raised this as a concern, and actually sadly really speaks to what I'm going to be talking about, which is that this isn't an individual activity. We need to think about this more broadly within a society and within workplaces, that it becomes a normalized form of transgressive behavior. And so you'll see on your screen, these are from the weekend, but then it affects all kinds of different contexts. And so as we start thinking about sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, we need to think about it in this kind of wider context. So let me make a case that we should be thinking about this as a dynamic process going forward. And so as we start to impact on this, we can view it in terms of an individual perpetrator, and I deliberately am going to use those type of languages, and their target. I am not going to use the language of victim, because I think that that is erroneous, and I think it's extremely unhelpful to people who are targeted by individuals. So what I'm talking about here is an individual who is targeted by a perpetrator for this form of transgressive activity. And that has consequences both for them in that interaction with that perpetrator in that one times frame, but it also has potentially ongoing implications for them, both in terms of other people and their interactions with other people who may also view them as a target, or but also may result in the ongoing and an escalation from that particular target. So what I'd like to suggest, and I'm aware that this is slightly controversial, but what I'd like to suggest is actually when we start looking at workplace misconduct, it could be a very important means of identifying other transgressive activities that are going on within a workplace. So what I'm going to be arguing is that maybe this is a form of, if you like, looking at a canary in a mine. So it's giving you information about a workplace, that there are likely to be other things that are going on within that workplace that should be examined and investigated more fully. So we have a direct impact, but we also have this event occurring within a wider context. Now you'll see on your screen that what I've shown are people with their backs to the perpetrator, and I've deliberately picked this because I think it actually illustrates very well what I'm trying to argue here, which is that what happens when a perpetrator undertakes this, particularly within a workplace, is that other people can choose to separate themselves from it. But actually what they do is they form a barrier that protects the perpetrator. And that happens in two specific ways. First of all, by not speaking up and articulating their concerns about what has happened, they inhibit the perpetrator's means for self-regulation, and I'll come on and talk about that in more detail. But also what I'm going to argue is that they form this protective barrier that then removes the means to socially sanction, which is a really important means of inhibiting this process going forward. And I think as a society, we're seeing increasingly the normalization and the sexualization of society that has very important consequences within organizations more widely. So they form this protective unit around the individual, and that has different consequences, both in terms of meaning that people have different choices and very invidious choices, so that they too can choose to remain silent, or if they feel strongly about it, they can choose to remove themselves from the context. But in so doing, they also then diminish the means for regulating and changing this behaviour. And finally, and sadly, what can often happen is that people start to see themselves in this transgressive way as well. So it normalises that form of misconduct within a workplace, so that other people then feel that they too could start to do this. And I think that's what I would be arguing is potentially happening in the Houses of Commons. So what we see is this vicarious effect and this ambient effect that affects other people. So it means that our means to self-sanction and to ostracize and challenge the individual is diminished. And this idea that people then feel that they too want to start in being involved within this activity. So we end up then with this sense that it becomes a toxic workplace, and a more pervasive forms of wrongdoing are free to occur, because if you haven't challenged on this, what other things is that perpetrator potentially doing? So the framework that I use for my research draws on Bandura's socio-cognitive theory. And what he's arguing within that is that we need to think about sexual misconduct very differently from other forms of behaviour. And I'm going to outline this in detail to you. So what he's arguing is we have these co-determinants of these behaviours that occur within a space. So they're partly to do with the individual, they're partly to do with the type of behaviour, and they're partly to do with the environment in which they occur. And they're both motivated and regulated by these three aspects. And then surrounding them is this idea that they can be inhibited in these three ways. And what I'm going to be suggesting is that sadly, sometimes one of these three is diminished, sometimes two, sometimes more, and that has an impact on our means to regulate them. So as we start thinking about this form of transgressive behaviour, we need to understand that people have a view of themselves. They want to see themselves as good people. And there are different mechanisms, particularly cognitive mechanisms, that we undertake that allow us to maintain our own sense of our self-identity, our positive self-identity, and separate ourselves from the actions that we undertake. And this is what's called moral disengagement. And there are four distinct aspects for this. So first of all, we can start thinking differently about these detrimental practices that have occurred. And that can be a justification for what has happened. It could be euphemistic labeling. So we see this within a war context in particular, where we talk about collateral damage rather than the killing of civilians. And it's interesting within the Ukraine crisis, we're seeing that language start to roll back as people want to stop this disengagement from happening. But Bandura also identifies different means that we have of shifting the responsibility, and that can either be to displace the responsibility onto others, often higher up within the organisation, or to diffuse it into this collective as a way of allowing us to feel better about what we've done because it's shared by other people. A third aspect we can undertake is thinking about and changing how we think about the impact of it. And that can either be to minimize what we've actually done, or by actively ignoring or denying that it's happened, or misconstruing the consequences of it to make it appear a much more benign activity. And you'll see I'm going to be talking in particular about a social mechanism that we use there later. Finally, we can focus on the target, as I've called them. Bandura talks about it in terms of victim, and he identifies what he calls the more extreme forms of moral disengagement, which is to dehumanize the person, which allows us to do these abhorrent activities to them, or to attribute blame in some way to them. So you were wearing the short skirt, you were drunk. All of these are ways of shifting the blame onto the individual target for our activities. So this is Bandura's framework, what we've been increasingly starting to look at is the notion of collective moral disengagement. So the way that instead of it just being one individual, these events happen within a unit, and that the unit starts to slide into this slippery slope. What I'm going to be suggesting is that it's almost like a frog boiling experience, that people don't necessarily notice what's happening to them, and particularly because of these moral disengagement mechanisms, their means to check, their means to think differently about their behaviour is diminished, and it's only down the line, once this has all come out, that they suddenly realise what has actually happened. So when we start thinking about transgressive activities, work psychologists have identified a framework that we can use to think about the severity of these. So what they are focusing on is the idea that these are voluntary activities, so somebody undertakes these from their own perspective, and that they are a violation both in terms of the organisational norms, but they have important consequences for the well-being of the organisation, but also its members. And specifically here, I would like to identify the target. So Robinson and Bennett in their work identify specifically this kind of idea that you get these different dimensions. So on the top line, what they're talking about there is the organisational targets. So they would contend that these are less severe because it's not a person that's involved in it. And they range from more minor, which is to do with what they call a production deviance, which is not doing your job the way that you're supposed to do your job. So cutting corners would be a form of minor organisationally focused counterproductive work behaviours. The more severe end of this is what they call property deviance, and that is to deliberately steal things from the organisation. Then when we start shifting and thinking about this more as an interpersonal issue, they identify a more minor that's all around what they call political deviance. And actually this is, if you like, tit for tats. It's about blaming somebody else, counter-blaming, and this is a form that they would regard as less severe. But then the more severe issues are to do with stealing from an individual, again, because that's a violation of that individual and that individual's property. And then most severe is sexual misconduct. So the work that Annie alluded to in terms of health, this looks at these violations within a particular context. And what I'll be arguing is that actually it's an important context to look at two specific aspects. So first is to do with trust. And you can see on the image on the screen, we've got these 4 different health professionals. So what we know about this context is that actually trust is fundamental to our relationships with health professionals. If we don't have trust, actually we might not get better because we might not obey the regimes that they ask us to take in terms of drugs or in terms of our physiotherapy, etc. So really it's an intimate relationship that we have with a health professional, and it's one where the stakes can be very high. So you're either incapacitated and vulnerable in that situation, or there may be limited alternatives for you to be able to resource either in terms of time or in terms of specific expertise. So also what I would argue is that the person accepts the vulnerability on the basis that this is a health professional, and so we have what's called role-based trust. So I can transfer my trust from one doctor to another because I assume that their training makes them able to do this job and makes me able to trust them. That can be enshrined in things like the Hippocratic Oath, but again, it's all around the trust in that personal relationship when I need the health professional. A second aspect here is what's called confidence. And specifically what we're looking at here are 2 aspects. So you can see I kind of put a complicated diagram showing interconnections, but really there are 2 institutions that we have to have confidence in. So first of all, there's the employing organisation in which the professional is based. And secondly, there's the regulator who's responsible for ensuring that they are fit to practice. What we can see from both of those institutions is that there are forms of control that again help us feel more confident. And work we did back in 2017 looked at trust and control, and we identified 4 mechanisms there. So in particular, input controls, so that an employing organisation and a regulator know the type of person, the qualifications, the levels that are required to enter. Secondly, we might have process regulation in which there are confidence around how a procedure should be carried out. Again, fitness to practice is one of these mechanisms. We would have had output control that again is about what the professional does and the outcome of that. And then finally, we would have what's called normative controls, which is to do with the sanctions and punishments that are result from somebody who deviates from that. And so those could be both formal in terms of fitness to practice, or they could be informal in terms of peers coming in and sharing and saying to somebody that they've not done something properly. So when we think about misconduct, we have to understand that it's actually undermining these twin aspects, both of the professional and the institution, and it has consequences for that professional, but also the entire profession and maybe that entire context in terms of competence and integrity. So the work that we did with Professional Standards Authority, we looked at over 6,500 cases of professional wrongdoing, and we were particularly looking at 3 different groups. So we were looking at doctors, nurses, and a large group that are called allied professionals. So this is anyone from physiotherapy. At this point, it included social workers, but they have subsequently come out of this register. And we were interested in particularly looking at sexual misconduct. So the first study that we did, if I just show you this, what we did was we looked at all forms of misconduct that had occurred, and going back to the earlier taxonomy that I identified, we looked at how these particular forms of misconduct, these were the most common that we identified. So actually these accounted for between 72 and 76% of the charges or the professional misconducts against individuals. So you can see there's a predominance of green along the bottom. So this is saying that these were what's called production deviances. So they're the less severe organisational level dimensions that were about people not doing their job as they're supposed to do their job. But what you'll also notice is this area here where we have sexual misconduct. And what we found was that in relation to the number of people on the register, we found that this was predominantly more likely to be something that was undertaken by doctors relative to the others. So you can see this is showing you the scale of it. So in relation to the other forms of misconduct, this was really quite a striking difference. So let me talk now about how Bandura and his socio-cognitive framework would view this type of behaviour. So he's really identifying the fact, and the literature tells us that this, if we look at people undertaking this behaviour, we can view them in terms of having a set of beliefs and goals. We also can see this through the literature as something that is much more likely to be undertaken by men, and it's about control, it's about a means of exerting that control and power in a particular context. So when we look at our study, what we found was that 70% of these offences were multiple offences by doctors. So again, that's suggesting that it wasn't just a single issue, there were multiple cases that they had. We found strikingly that although we were looking at nurses and midwives, we found no midwives in terms of sexual misconduct, which in and of itself is interesting because often there is a case being made that it's about availability. So it's, if we look at, for example, obs and gynae doctors, where we find that they are quite a high rate amongst them. Yet when we look at the same opportunities, you could argue, in terms of midwives, we found no cases of sexual misconduct from midwives. You can see then that in particular, it was much more likely to be a male phenomena, and in particular 100% of the cases that involved a doctor were male doctors. There were no female doctors. We found that the targets were predominantly patients, but they could include co-workers, and that predominantly it was women who were targeted for this form of misconduct. So let's think about the behaviour now in terms of what we know and what the evidence is telling us. So we can view sexual misconduct in terms of, this is PINA's definition, so unwanted sexual advances. It's viewed as a goal-directed behaviour, and this is where some very interesting work, particularly looking at health, comes to the fore, because what it's found is that unusually in relation to other forms of misconduct, sexual misconduct is more likely to be a repeat behaviour. So once somebody starts doing this, they're more likely to repeat this pattern of behaviour, and that is particularly important as we start thinking about sanctions. Also, it's a hidden form of behaviour that often involves two people and two different accounts of what's happened. And in particular, the literature would argue that it can arise from a negative effect, so people feeling angry. In particular, that can be in terms of an injustice where a sexual advance has been previously spurned, or it can be undertaken by people, particularly men, that have a need to be and have a particular image of themselves within a context. So what we found within our study was that we found there was much more likely to be moral disengagement from men. We also found that how people talked about what had happened, they were much more likely to use these excuses. So particularly, I didn't understand because I'm from a different culture, or they were likely to diffuse responsibility further by saying that they had been affected either by drugs or alcohol, so that their capacity was diminished. We also found that there was likely to be much greater levels of moral disengagement used in cases of where it was a colleague. So in particular, attributing blame to the target or trying to diffuse responsibility by saying that there was a culture within the workplace that had led to this. So it's not just me, it's all of us that are doing this. So that's how the behaviour has been viewed. Now, importantly, and this is where I think law has an important role here, is to start thinking about this in terms of a behaviour that takes place within an environment. Now, what we know about environments is that they create a set of hurdles that an individual has to overcome in order to allow themselves to behave in this way. And there are three different hurdles that can be in operation within a particular work context. So first of all, we have what's called an imposed environment. And this is where there are rules, there are conditions from that workplace that diminish or limit what can happen. But again, what we find with particularly perpetrators is that how they recognize or view those rules as inhibiting them vary. And so again, you can alter how you see these rules applying to me. Next, we have this idea about selected environments. So in particular, the choice of career that I make can determine what type of workplace I might find myself in. Also, what we found is that the social groups, so the groups around which I have agency and activity with, can be selected. So I pick people who think about the world the same way that I do, or who reinforce that. And finally, in terms of selected environments, what we can find is that people specifically pick either agency or locum work that makes them transient within a particular workplace. So by the time their transgressive behaviour is detected, they can move on to the next place so that they're not there long enough. But again, that's a selected choice that they're making in terms of the environment. Also, they pick particular targets. So here, what we know again from the literature is that you're much more likely to be a target if you are economically dependent on your work. So people, and women in particular, from lower socioeconomic groups are much more likely to be targeted. They're also much more likely to be targeted where they might be an unreliable or an uncredible witness in this context. So again, I would argue that perpetrators select these people because of the context that they're working in. And finally, we have the means to create particular context. And in particular, these are about starting to recognise that how particularly leaders operate can help to reframe and diminish the sanctions for particular people so that somebody becomes a more favoured individual and therefore their behaviour is discounted relative to other people. So again, this idea about how a perpetrator actually creates the context that allows them to do these activities. Now, there has been some work that has done looking specifically at the cultures of these, and again identifying that there are key types of culture here that we tend to find where this is much more likely to occur. So those are contexts where a woman is viewed as taking a man's role. So we might find this within, say, surgery in the past, where it was predominantly a male rugby player activity, and now women coming into that. We also know, again, from contexts like the arts, that where you have a competitive context where there is an important role of informal groups, again, sexual violence and sexual harassment can be an important way of contributing to a leader and their resources. So again, we find that there are particular cultures where these are likely to happen. So when we look at the work that we've been doing, what we identified significantly, and we were matching the workplace then to, we were drilling down to see where did these actually take place. And you'll see we had a number of workplaces that I've called hotspots. So hospitals, particularly private spaces within a health context, GPs, private clinics such as physiotherapy clinics. Interestingly, ambulances were also, and if you think about this, the perpetrator is moving around their private space, either taking them into the victim and target's home or then transporting them. So again, it's a private space that they are created. What we found was also not only were these likely to be workplaces where you were likely to get single events, they were also likely to be workplaces where you got multiple events. We also drilled down to look in more detail at the type of climates. And again, we found some important differences to these types of high level events. So in particular, we found that these were places that had long working hours. They had high levels of workplace violence, so that was bullying and harassment that could be either from the patient and or from colleagues, and that they had low levels of diversity, equality and inclusion training. So the training to make people question and challenge wasn't there. And in particular, in the subsequent study I did looking at moral mindsets, we found that there was this relationship between longer working hours and the levels of moral disengagement, particularly victim blaming, that we found coming through. So let's think now about these inhibition factors, which kind of this workplace climate is starting to make us think about. So Bandura has argued that there are these three forms of inhibition. So the first is to do with self-evaluation. And in particular, what the studies are showing is that these can be inhibited in particular ways. So where people are working very, very long hours, their means to self-regulate, to think about what they're doing, they simply do not have time to do that. We also found that where people are working in a context that creates a negative affect, so by that I mean where they feel angry or scared, again, these are likely to diminish their capacity to reflect and think differently about them. And so when we started looking at the details, what we found, as I've indicated before, that moral disengagement is an important mechanism for maintaining, preserving our positive image of ourselves. What we found from our work was that you got some significant shifts that were implying people's means to self-evaluate, self-check were being diminished here. So in particular, how they viewed their practices was different, displacing responsibility onto others, actually denying that they'd done anything, or blaming the target. All of these suggest that people were not reflecting on their behaviours. A second aspect that we can think about then in terms of these inhibitors is the social dimensions. So what we found here was that workplaces where people create different norms If you remember, I talked before about how you could pick your work group or your break group. Again, these are ways that you can reduce people challenging what you've actually done. More insidiously, we can do this through banter, because banter allows us to subvert and in particular use humour as a means of creating a different view of our behaviour. So we can make it perceived more benign, and that you, the viewer, or the challenger for my behaviour, just don't have a sense of humour, rather than that this is somehow transgressive. So again, humour is really important in terms of removing the moral content and casting the behaviour and events as far more benign, and people are testing out and shifting those boundaries. So what we find is that there's a diffusion of responsibility to that group, so that it's normalizing these transgressive actions, and in particular starting to think more about the fact that these are viewed in a different way, so that they are not viewed as something that is transgressive, they are viewed as just something that goes on in this workplace. So what we also find through the literature is that often, particularly in stressful situations where there are diminished resources, sexual relationships are a way of managing those stressful events. So they're a way of getting resources for you, or having somebody that protects and looks after you in that context. So they're important in terms of, again, showing how social situations can be used and also removed. So thinking about legal sanctions, importantly, we found that there were some important differences going on here between the different professions. So we found in particular that you were much more likely to be struck off the register permanently if you were a nurse rather than a doctor. And in particular, for multiple offences, again, we found that it wasn't the case that you would be struck off. And if you think about this within a health context, violations against a patient target and multiple patient targets, or the same individual patient multiply targeted, are an extreme form of violation to that individual and of the system. So again, what we were finding was that they weren't always permanently struck off and removed from the register. So again, it's implying that legal sanctions within this context are not being used as effectively as they could. So I've highlighted the fact that sexual misconduct is a particular form of behaviour that it's actually very different from other forms of transgressive behaviour, and maybe is much more likely to be a recidivist, a repeat activity. It's something that is much more likely to occur from particular types of perpetrator and within particular environments that enable the individual to deliberately select somewhere that facilitates these activities. And then around them, we have these three forms of inhibitors that I would argue may be derailed through the working conditions that mean that people are simply overwhelmed and have not got time to think about their own behaviour, or through the social relationships that are going on, or through the failure for legal sanctions to operate effectively. So what can we do about this? Well, I would argue that we need to understand workplaces in a slightly different way. And there's two clear differences here that you can see on the screen. So first of all, I think we've got the means to identify hotspots, and that can come, as I've indicated, through understanding workplace climate measures, also understanding the incidence of diversity and inclusion training that are going on, and the pervading climate in terms of bullying and harassment. So from these, we know that they are likely to diminish the means of people being able to self-reflect, but also there might be issues to do with sanctions not being in operation effectively in these places where people feel that they can get away, they are green-lighted to do these activities. On a more positive stand, I would argue that we can do more work around changing the social conditions, and that is through training and creating a context where people feel that they can be more upstanding. So rather than bystanding, what I'm arguing for is upstanding, to get people to challenge and to notice and to say they're not happy with something. So in particular, these can be maintained through training and reinforcement of norms for the workplace, and also through identifying particular targets. And again, the literature identifies particular groups that are more likely to be impacted in these areas. So I think there's more we can do around specific targets and helping to support those targets. And they can be women, naive and vulnerable individuals, people who are more economically dependent, or people who might have some cognitive incapacity, either through special needs or through mental health, so that we can really focus on environments where these targets are. So I'd like to just leave you with a thought that there are particular roles for leaders in these workplaces. So again, we did some work looking at wrongdoing within a high stakes context. And you can see on the screen, we've got two different departments. So we had Department 2, where we asked people about the different forms of misconduct that they undertook. So we had no misconduct in Department 2 from the manager, but we did in terms of the manager in Department 1. This is what we found in terms of the staff underneath that individual, so that we had individuals admitting to occasional forms of misconduct in one specific area and others identifying multiple. But in a context where the manager was also undertaking these behaviours, we had a much more consistent evidence of wrongdoing across that whole environment. So again, it really greenlights the fact that a perpetrator who is a leader has this much bigger impact on those around them. So my takeaways are that we need to think very carefully about environments, and in particular think about the social environment that allows these to happen, and think about the individuals and their means to self-regulate, but also seeing that the rules do not apply to them, that they are the exception. And specifically, finally, to recognise that sexual misconduct is much more likely to be a recidivist activity. So again, how we think about this in terms of sanctioning, in terms of recognising that once somebody has started, their means for self-containment may be diminished. So let me leave that there. So that's me. You'll see on this, I've attempted to list some papers that are available, and also the professional standards reports. And then we had a new, together with Engender, we launched on Wednesday last week, I think, to the Scottish Parliament, a new piece looking again at sexual misconduct. So I will make these available afterwards to Annie to share with you. So let me stop sharing and answer your questions.